Now, thank you. Now I'm pleased to invite Bianca Baumann here to the podium. She is a researcher since 2021 and research assistant at the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz and a doctoral student with Martin Krings, I think. Matthias, yes, right, Matthias. What did I say, Martin? No, okay, Matthias. So previously she was a member of the project Provenance Research in Non-European Collections and Ethnology in Lower Saxony at the Landesmuseum in Hanover. And as I already mentioned here, her talk will be on the imponderables, die Unwägbarkeiten der ethnologischen Provenienzforschung. Some talks will be in German, others in English, so I hope you are fine with that. Ms. Baumann, it's your turn. And now I just thank you.
Well, as I said, I'm very happy to be here today to have the opportunity to exchange ideas with you all. So in my talk, I will present my research from the last few years, which I started at the Landesmuseum Hanover, and which I conducted as part of my PhD project. During this time, I was investigating objects from colonial context, and in this connection, a type of research has emerged that is often referred to as ethnological or also post-colonial provenance research. And this type of research often looks at how the objects came to Germany, whether they were looted, exchanged, donated, and often the specific historical context is looked at. So in my talk, I want to show how unpredictable and surprising and also contradictory the examination of the provenance of ethnographic objects can be, and ultimately I'd like to raise the question of what kind of research or what is needed to find a future handling with the collections. So provenance research, as it has been shaped by art history, searches for the sequence of verifiable owners and changes of ownership of cultural artifacts. So this is a quote from the guidelines for the standardization of provenance research. I argue that the ambiguity and the relationality of objects, the incompleteness of documentation, and the Eurocentric data situation, especially of ethnographic objects, stand in the way of a definite clarification of provenances or provenance chains and the nature of change of ownerships. So at my research, I looked at two convolutes from Cameroon that are, as I said, held at the Lower Saxony State Museum in Hanover. Today I will focus on one of these convolutes. So these 6 objects are part of that one, and I will focus on one object in particular. So the director of the State Museum in 1913 purchased these 6 objects from an ethnographic art dealer, Julius Konietzko, who is very well known in that field. And the dealer had stated that they came from a so-called punitive expedition in Bamenda in 1911, which was led by Governor Jesko von Puttkamer, and that the objects had been requisitioned from the Sultan of Bamenda. So the appropriation of the objects was directly linked to a context of violence. A historiographical examination of this information has shown that Jesko von Puttkamer was no longer in Cameroon in 1911. Also, the reference to the Sultanate of Bamenda is very misleading. Bamenda is a town, you can see it here, in the middle. It is not marked with a square, so it's not a kingdom, but it's a town where there was an important military station from the Germans from 1902. Similarly, there was no punitive expedition in Bamenda in 1911, and there was certainly none in connection with Jesko von Puttkamer, who, as far as I know, never was in this particular region. It is also questionable why a Sultan of Bamenda is mentioned. Rulers in the region bear the title von. The Germans referred to them as kings or chiefs, Könige or Häuptlinge, but a Sultan, why a Sultan is mentioned is questionable. All of my interlocutors from Cameroon also pointed out that there was no Sultan of Bamenda and also questioned that acquisition history. If you look at Cameroon during the colonial period, you often encounter Sultan Njoya, who played a strategic role with the head of the Bamenda station. Njoya played a very important role in the propaganda in Germany and was also instrumental in shaping the image of Africa's chiefdoms in Germany. So this newspaper article in the Globus was the first publication of Sultan Njoya and his throne. And after this publication, a lot of museum responsibles wanted to have a throne like that. Njoya himself, he took the title Sultan when he converted to Islam. There were other sultanates further north in the Adamawa region, but Bamenda, on the other hand, is still predominantly Christian today. It seems that Konietzko's information about the appropriation of the convolute included people and places that were known in Germany to make them seem authentic. For example, von Puttkamer was discussed in the German media because of his scandals. Bamenda was often mentioned because of that military station. So it is also noteworthy that the dealer has passed on precise provenance information that fulfills exactly that requirement. Persons, places, time, and the nature of change of ownerships were named. The majority of objects in ethnographic collections don't hold such specific details. So as an art dealer and through his very close cooperation with museums, he knew the requirements of museums' documentation of objects. He was also aware which type of objects and provenances were in demand in museums. So through the reference to people, places, and that temporal embedding, the objects were given a status as old, traditional, used, rare, and original. So in this way, the information valorizes the object for ethnographic collections. So in this case, I would argue that the provenance information must rather be seen as part of the commodification process. At that time, monetary value of ethnographic objects was measured by criteria such as authenticity, origin, age, and cultural significance, and the given information provided these. So according to my research, that provenance information therefore seemed to be proven false. I then, that's a poor picture, I'm sorry, that was the art dealer. I then looked at the objects themselves with various people from Cameroon. Here you can see Hervé Yumbi, an artist. Sorry, that picture appears very dark. On the laptop it looks better. And Paul Clisten Dassi Kuju on the right. So this collaboration helped to exchange about the objects, to discuss the functions, and among other things, to find out the current ascription of meaning. A question, or a key question in my research was how people in Cameroon assess the presence of artifacts from their country in German museums today, and I wanted to find out what should be done with the objects in future. So although that acquisition history of the so-called punitive expedition was proven wrong, the throne as a royal object in particular raises doubts whether it was passed on voluntarily. Victor Ngiti, an art historian from the Institute of Fine Arts in Nkonsamba of the University of Douala, for example, doubted the fairness of exchange, and I have a short clip, I hope that works. Yes.
Find it difficult to accept that a fair deal could be struck between people who didn't know the significance of the object they were giving out and those who took the same objects, who bought them at, say, 50,000 francs and sold them at 50 million francs, or used them and transacted them for several years and moved them from one museum to the other. There was no fair deal. You see, otherwise, there was a fair deal. King Joya would not have given his throne to the Kaiser. Huh? As if, in fact, giving out your throne means giving out your kingdom, giving out your kingship. It means you are no longer king. You see, it was in circumstances of fear of repression, fear of reprisals, and fear of the unknown that pushed, you see, the Africans to give up these objects. And we talk about the authors.
So Ngiti questions that voluntary nature of handing over a throne, despite the well-known documented case of the famous throne of Sultan Njoya, which is now in the possession of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation and is displayed at the Humboldt Forum today. So he assesses the cultural relevance of a throne for the king and the community to judge how it was passed on and exchanged, and also scrutinizes the trade between unequal partners. A student from a workshop that was organized by Isabella Boja, Rachel Mariembe, and myself argued in a similar way to Ngiti. He commented on another throne that was brought to Hanover and pointed out that the maintenance of the claim to the power was at risk if the throne was abroad. So here's the quote. He said, "It's on the throne that the king leads the people, so we think that it's important for these thrones to return, because when there's no throne, you get the impression that the kingdom's activity have ground to a halt. For a king to govern, there has to be a throne, and if there's no throne, there's a standstill. So it's important that these thrones come back and are installed in African museums, and in this configuration of things, we also take into account the aura of the work. It's often said that a work of art is only as meaningful as the environment in which it was created. Some works of art do not play the same role in an unfamiliar environment as they do in the environment in which they were created." So for the student, the museums are the appropriate places for safekeeping the throne, and one must know that in the West region in Cameroon, museums are often part of the kingdoms. So if you return the throne to a museum, it becomes again part of the kingdom. And also these museums are often understood as living museums, so the objects are still in use if they are needed. So my exchange with people from Cameroon provided insights into how changes of ownership of individual objects are assessed today. The documented way in which the objects were appropriated in that specific historic context was less relevant than the question of what significance the object has for this society. However, I couldn't find any consensus in the Cameroonian community on the question whether the throne should be restituted. In contrast to those two opinions presented so far, Patrick Momo, who is a tourist guide, took a very different stance on how to deal with this throne. He said, "It seems to me that it takes a lot of financial resources to keep objects, to get them through years and years and to keep them in their original state. So if we bring these objects back here, do we have the financial resources to be able to preserve them? I doubt it very much, because the little heritage we have left is suffering a lot from conservation problems. So I would simply say that if these objects are well maintained in Europe, for me, the most important thing is that they tell the real story of their provenance." So as a tourist guy, he often visits museums in that region, in the west region of Cameroon. And during my research, I also visited museums with him, which sometimes was only possible because of his connections. A lot of museums were closed down at the time, and only because he had the right connections, he contacted the person, and they opened it for me so that I could have a look. So during my research, I encountered quite a lot of people in Cameroon who spoke out against the restitution of Cameroonian cultural artifacts to Cameroon for different reasons, and due to time I can't present more voices, unfortunately. Also, other students in the mentioned workshop asked for financial help to maintain the museums and the objects alongside the restitution of objects. So it became very clear during my research that there are very different expectations in Cameroon with regard to future handling of the objects, and that the provenance is not necessarily decisive for this. It was noticeable that often rather the cultural relevance of an object was considered when determining an object's future. This, amongst other aspects, shows that the provenance research, which often looks at that historical context, is rather based on Eurocentric premises. For people in Cameroon, the social and spiritual connection between objects and society was more relevant. Past events were primarily assessed on the basis on current practices and attributions of meaning to the objects. But there's also the possibility that this particular throne was made for the art market in the first place, as this type of throne often appeared on the art market, but that was never considered by my interlocutors. So in my research, the multi-perspective approach often led to irreconcilable contradictions within the Cameroonian society. The individual judgments and wishes regarding the collection objects became very clear. Just as object meanings are situational, temporary, and personal, the same applies to the judgment of the object's futures handling. Above all, a throne which carries many meanings and whose removal can go hand in hand with colonial control processes and hegemonic claims seem to trigger particularly controversial positions. It highlights the challenge of finding an ideal way of dealing with it in the future. So the relationality and with it the various ways of looking at the objects came to light. So also that new aspect of the significance of the object, which is today also considered for restitution in the German guidelines, also remains ambiguous, changeable, and based on individual attributions. So provenance research in the classical sense, which focuses on the sequence of and manner of changes of ownership, ultimately does not justice to the complexity of objects. I believe that for the presented convolute, it is hopeless to ever decipher the actual provenance of the objects. And I think that counts for the majority of objects in ethnographic collections. That multi-perspective research is then able to bring to light the diverse interpretations of the objects and their current attributions of meaning. It can also reveal the ambivalences. So I think it is above all today's generation of descendants of the former object users with whom the discussion about how to deal with those collections must be taken up, and a consensus must be found. So their approaches, their perspectives and attitudes to dealing with these collections should be respected and their wish recognized and taken seriously. I therefore understand an engagement with objects from colonial context as a negotiation process. Perceiving collection as an open space for negotiation opens up the possibility of recognizing that objects unfold their potential as versatile, unsteady, imponderable, and variable carriers of meaning. Thank you very much for your attention.